Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where in the world you are joining from today. My name is James Mackey, and I'm the Managing Director of Project Investments focused on carbon capture and methane reduction implementation projects for the firm OGCI Climate Investments. I'm delighted to join you today. I thank both the participants and the conference organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today about enabling the circular carbon economy. So we're going to talk about the circular carbon economy. And first, I'd like to start by explaining who OGCI Climate Investments is. First, OGCI is the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a consortium of the 11 oil majors shown on this slide. And the consortium has the goal of taking practical action on climate change. And part of those actions is forming the slightly more than $1 billion climate investments fund that invests in solutions to decarbonize the oil and gas sector and other hard to abate sectors such as commercial transportation and heavy industry. We deliver lower carbon via our investments through an investing strategy, implementing our solutions with our member companies and our external network, and the combination of those things will form an impact at global scale. The challenge that we have, which leads to the focus at climate investments, or what we refer to as CI, is the 50 gigatons of man-made greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere every year. Of those gigatons, roughly 35 gigatons are sequestered by natural carbon sinks in the environment, but that leaves 15 gigatons that we need to deal with in order to keep global warming to within the 2 degrees Celsius that the Paris Accord has mandated. Of those man-made gases, 3/4 of them are from the energy and industrial sectors. So climate investments has chosen to focus our efforts on reducing that 3/4 of the issue. We have 3 particular focuses that we have. One is reducing methane emissions, particularly in the oil and gas sector. Also, reducing carbon dioxide from energy and industrial sectors, including transportation. And finally, recycling and storing carbon dioxide. And we do that through carbon capture, usage, and sequestration. Climate Investments has 2 divisions. One is a venture division, which invests in technologies that address greenhouse gases. And the second is the team that I lead, which focuses on project investments. So I'll show you just a graphic on how we work in project investing to address these things. Climate investments, we typically will address the funding needs for the early stages of projects when they have the biggest need for capital that is scarce. And this is what I usually refer to as development capital. And that will take projects through a pre-feed and a feed stage. And then when a project is de-risked and begins construction, that is usually when longer term capital will join. So that climate investment support is sort of this top section during the risk reduction stage. And then the bottom shows co-investors that we work with. Obviously, developers will be in for the early riskier stages. But then as we get into construction and operations, then corporate and strategic and financial investors will typically find these asset classes to be attractive. In some cases in the United States, we have access to tax credits that add additional financial incentive, and third-party tax equity will often invest, but usually for the lower risk stages after construction and during operations. In some cases, our member companies may be involved in supporting the deployment through acting as markets for different projects and their output, as well as being co-investors, which is their option to choose. So now I'd like to turn to the circular carbon economy. Why don't we talk about what that circular carbon economy is? I think many of you are familiar with capturing carbon and different things that can be used, it can be used for. But if we were to look at the full value chain for carbon, it can be something that is reused and not just a byproduct, but can have benefits for other sectors. So if we start at the top left of this graphic, we focus on, or the circular carbon economy starts with a focus on the full value of energy efficiency. And that can be in reducing energy consumption as well as reducing the or the emissions intensity of different processes. It also involves capturing fugitive emissions from the oil and gas sector, and also producing lower carbon fuels that may include hydrogen and biodiesel. Many of these processes will produce carbon dioxide. So one of the next things we do is to capture that carbon dioxide. One would be from stationary locations, so capturing at the site of the emissions. But also there is a growing emphasis on direct air capture, where the capture can happen not necessarily where the emissions are intensive, but it may be other locations where it's easier to build a capture facility or where you might have access to the energy that is needed to process it. Moving from carbon capture, we go to the next area of the circular economy, which is what you can do with the CO2. And there's two different things that one can do with it. One is storing it and the other is using it. In terms of usage, that would be in the bottom right hand of this graphic, there are different ways that CO2 can be used. One of the most prolific right now is in enhanced oil recovery, what we refer to as EOR. And this is where CO2 is pumped into producing basins to help extract additional hydrocarbons to make for a lower carbon footprint barrel of oil and also do it in a more efficient way. There are also biosinks, so sinks where the carbon can naturally be stored. And then there's also subsurface storage where we would also pump the CO2 underground, but it would be sequestered and not used for the extraction of hydrocarbons. Now, beyond the storage of CO2, there are also other uses for it. So one would be in different material sciences and industrial processes. It can be used in synthetic biofuels. And we've also seen it used for things such as concrete and the plastics industry. When we refer to the circular carbon economy, we do talk about what we refer to as the 4 R's, which are reducing, reusing, recycling, and removing the CO2. I have a slide that'll briefly discuss each of these. Reducing CO2 includes all carbon mitigation options that reduce the amount that enters into the atmosphere. So this is really reducing the carbon emissions intensity of different processes. So that might be energy efficiency in terms of power consumption or fuel consumption. It can also be switching from a higher carbon intensive fuel to a lower carbon intensive fuel. So for instance, switching from coal to natural gas. It can also be switching from diesel to natural gas in sectors such as oil production. Reusing carbon capture is something that we talked about just a moment ago, and that is taking the captured CO2 and using it in another process that does not necessarily have to involve a chemical conversion. So enhanced oil recovery is one of the obvious things that we discussed, but also enhancements to concrete, such as using CO2 as a curing agent in making concrete. And this is something that we'll talk about a little bit further. There's also recycling, capturing and converting the carbon through conversion technologies that create a useful feedstock. Fertilizer, ammonia, methanol are some ways that this is currently being done. And also there are emerging technologies to use the CO2 as a feedstock for new products, such as plastics. Finally, removing CO2. CO2 being removed from the atmosphere in things such as direct air capture, where we go beyond capturing it from the source of emissions to just pulling it out of the air so that you have the flexibility to do it in multiple places. This is currently one of the more expensive ways of capturing CO2, but there are policy incentives and lots of capital that is trying to advance this technology to bring the cost of capture in direct air capture down. I'd like to spend a little time talking about some of the current investments that OGCI Climate Investments has in both technologies as well as projects for CO2 capture. So this graphic shows 3 different investments that we have in technologies. The first is a company called Svante. Svante is advancing a new technology for capturing carbon dioxide, and their technology has a number of benefits. One is that it does not have the same chemical intensity that the amine capture technologies do today. So one advantage there is that you don't have as much of the chemical storage that is required. But another, in fact, perhaps more important aspect of the Svante technology is that it has the potential to lower the cost of capture by more than 50% over the conventional technologies that are in use today. And of course, the more we can lower the cost of capture, the more it will be adopted and the more impact we can have on CO2 removal. In the upper right, we have 2 other technologies that we have invested in. One is a company called Econic. Econic has a technology for using CO2 to create polyols that can be used in a number of industries, including the plastics industry. And then Solidia is one I referred to earlier. Solidia has a proprietary cemented concrete solution where the CO2 is used as a curing agent in Solidia's cement mixture for creating concrete. And there are 2 advantages of their process. One is that the CO2 gets captured forever in the concrete, but also by using CO2 as a curing agent for the concrete, it reduces the need for water by 80%. So in addition to the benefit of sequestering CO2 in a useful product, it also reduces water intensity, and obviously water is a very scarce resource. I'd now like to talk about some of our project investments. So there are 4 projects that I'll describe briefly, and they all have aspects that are similar in their recycling of carbon dioxide. The first is Net Zero Teesside, which is in the United Kingdom, in the Teesside industrial area. This is what we refer to as a hub project. The CO2 is going to be captured from a number of sources, including a new combined cycle natural gas power generation station, as well as other industrial emitters in the area. And we refer to it as a hub project because the multiple emitters will all put their CO2 into the same transportation and storage network. The CO2 will be piped out to the Endurance field in the North Sea, where it will be stored. This is a very large project where those transportation and storage assets will be amortized by a number of different companies that can share the cost. And this will have a significant impact by reducing CO2 emissions between 3 and 5 million tons per year. This is one that Climate Investments has advanced to the point where it is now moving into later stages of development, and 5 of the OGCI companies are participating as funders, developers, and will eventually be the owner-operator group for the project. The next project is one that's in the United States. It's one of 3 projects that we have in the United States, and it's called Wabash Valley Resources. And Wabash is going to gasify petroleum coke and use that process to create ammonia as well as hydrogen. And in that process, there will be significant CO2 that is created, and it will be captured and then stored underground in geologic storage. This project is located in Indiana, in the Midwest of the United States, where there is significant agriculture that can use the ammonia for fertilizer. There's some policy support that this project has received, including Section 45Q tax credits, which is a United States federal policy incentive that allows the entity that captures and stores the carbon to receive tax credits very similar to what the United States has done in the wind energy industry. Also, it has received grant funding from the US Department of Energy. This project is expected to begin operation sometime in the year 2023. The next 2 projects I'll talk about are both carbon capture from gas-fired power plants, and the CO2 is being used in both cases for enhanced oil recovery. One is the Elk Hills Power Plant. This is located in California, and our partner in the project is California Resources Corporation, which is the largest oil and gas producer in the state of California. This project is going to capture 1 million tons per year of CO2. It'll begin operating in the year 2024. And in addition to the Section 45Q tax credits, it also benefits from the low carbon fuel standard, which is an incentive that the state of California has for producing lower emission fuels. And the enhanced oil recovery is a way in which the CO2 qualifies for the LCFS. California also has a cap and trade program, and there is policy support for adding CO2 to that policy. It's something that is still in process, but we are optimistic that this will be an additional incentive that this project will qualify for. In another part of the United States, in a different producing region, Starwood Power has a power plant that's currently operating, and they're working with a developer called Elysian Ventures to add carbon capture to that plant and then transport it through existing pipelines to a producing region in the southern part of the United States, where the CO2 will be used for enhanced oil recovery. This one does not have access to the California LCFS, but it does have a greater level of impact with 1.5 million tons per year of CO2. And that additional scale, plus the availability of the 45Q tax credits, is something that will allow it to be economically viable. So these 4 projects that I've just described will have quite a significant impact, that in aggregate, they will reduce carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere by about 9 million tons per year. And that's the equivalent of taking 2 million cars with internal combustion engines off the road. So just in terms of scale, it's something that within the first few years of climate investments activity, we're very proud of being able to create this level of impact. That ends my prepared remarks. I believe there may be an opportunity for me to take some questions, but I do want to thank you very much for your attention. We're very excited about the opportunities that the circular economy brings to both the energy and industrial sectors, because in addition to helping the environment, these investments are demonstrating that there are business models available that are attractive to participants, and that this can be a very attractive asset class in terms of financial returns as well as environmental stewardship. So thank you very much, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.